Police officers have read it. Have you ever had an all units call? And if so, what happened? I was doing a ride along in college in a fairly small city in Georgia when we got an all available units call. We received the address, turned on the lights and siren, and raced across town at about 120 miles per hour. I had no clue about our destination until we arrived there. The only thing the officer said to me was, "No matter what happens, stay in the frickin' car. If you ever see someone with a gun, use the radio to let everyone know, like this." And then they showed me how. If any of us get shot, call for help and stay in the car. Then he took a deep breath, calmly got out of the car, and took a sprint towards a 40-person melee in front of the only strip club in town. We arrived at the scene first. Within the next 30 seconds, more and more police officers showed up until there were more officers than there were people fighting. The officer I was riding with was completely on his own for a 10-second eternity. And was able to rip about 10 people apart from fighting before backup arrived. It was the most courageous and awe-inspiring sight I have ever witnessed firsthand. When it was all over, he got back in the car with 3 drunk and beaten up dudes in the back, turned to me and said, "So, when you gonna sign up?" Story 2. Former military police here. While on duty with the Air Force Security Forces, I was patrolling the base housing as part of my law enforcement training. I'd been on station less than a year, and we heard a gunshot. We called it in immediately, and started heading in the direction we heard it from. Those houses were duplexes, and the neighbors called it in as well. BDOC, dispatch, sent us, another police unit, and then the entire external response force. This was on a nuke base. Even things that may seem unrelated to nuclear operations can actually have an effect on nuclear missions. We had 19 total people on scene within about 3 minutes. As the first ones on scene, my postal leader and I were already at the door when the rest of them showed up. I was really grateful that they arrived when they did, because we were just about to break down the door and go inside all by ourselves. We were told to hold for 30 seconds while the RF team got set up. Now we had a full stack and breaching equipment. I clenched my hand into a fist and tapped my helmet. This let the person with a special tool know it was time to come over. My team leader was second in line, so she had to throw a flashbang. One of the guys behind us passed it up, and as soon as the person in front opened the door, she tossed it inside. All it did was scare the crap out of the dog. The man was home alone because his wife was away. He was sitting in the dining room with a rifle on his lap. I was maybe a pound or so of pressure away from pulling the trigger on my rifle when I realized this dude's head was not fully intact. He had the SKS rifle in his lap because the strap got tangled on his arm when he fired the gun. As we cleared out the rest of the house per procedure, I had my non-firing hand basically stuffed in my mouth to stop me from puking. The man's wife sent him pictures and videos of her cheating on him multiple times, and told him she wanted a divorce. He thought there was no other way out, so he shot himself. The only good news from that day is that we actually had picture and video evidence to use to charge her with adultery. OSI, like an Air Force version of the FBI, pulled her out of her deployment and got her back on station, and we charged her with everything we could, including Articles 92, 107, 125, which covers sodomy, and 134. She lost her job, didn't get paid, and had to leave after serving for 11 years. Change. The neighbors took in the dog. He was a good boy and nobody wanted to see him go to the pound. What an absurdly disgusting and hurtful way to tell someone you want a divorce. If things aren't working out in your marriage, sure, whatever, it happens all the time, right? You do not need to dismantle a man like that. I'm glad they charged her with everything they could because that is disgusting behavior in my opinion. Story 3. 25 years ago, smallish rural town. My dad is a beat cop on patrol. My cat brought a live mouse into the kitchen and started playing with it. My mom is terrified of mice, so she called my dad to come home and deal with the situation. When dispatch reached my dad, they told him to switch to a secure line because there was an emergency at home. My dad's driving home to take care of the issue when all of the cops, probably like 4 of my small town, on patrol, come in with sirens and lights blazing on my house because they all heard there was an emergency. My mother was mortified. Okay, look, scared of rodents, sure, whatever. I was working as a military police officer on a big base. After my shift, the officers who were starting their shift gave me a ride back to my barracks so I could turn in my weapon. Suddenly we got a call for an all units, responding to a section of base housing. A military wife was having an affair with another soldier while her husband was on deployment. Supposedly the husband was due to return soon, so she tried to break it off with the other guy and he responded by stabbing her several times. My team leader and I were searching the tree line with our weapons drawn because it was dark outside. I was ahead and didn't realize it, but I passed the person we were looking for. Suddenly, he surprised me by stepping out and saying, "You're looking for me." It really scared me. My team leader kept him covered while I went to handcuff him, making sure to keep him pinned down in the muddy ground. Not sure what happened after that. He was taken to a holding cell by another squad and I got to go home. Ended up getting transferred from that base a few months later, but I know the wife survived the wounds. Story 5. I was hit by a person who was running away from a scary situation they weren't part of. They were panicking and carrying a gun. I was outside my car talking to someone who called for help, and my partner was busy dealing with the actual problem, so they didn't even see me get hit. No one knew I got hit or where I was because my radio went flying. Luckily there were a lot of witnesses who called 911 and found my radio. I confused the dispatcher because I was in so much shock that I came over the radio talking like I normally do, but I was bleeding badly from my head and broke my leg. I didn't feel the pain for about 2 hours. So I had that call come out because of me. I'm pretty sure I also got a policy made. Story 6. Not an officer, but I'll share one of my buddies. He was an older gent who has passed on now, but if Reddit had been a thing when he was younger, this would have been a top TIFU. When he was still new, he worked in a larger city. They had just gotten these shoulder mics. You know, the ones every cop now has mounted up by their mouths so they can call in easier. When new to them, they wore the cord in front of their shirts. Always in the damn way. And great handles when people wanted to wrestle. Jimmy was called one night to a bar brawl. He strolled into the bedlam almost over. He was a new recruit and always got stuck with the lousy jobs, so he was getting a reputation in his department for ruining his uniforms. It got so bad that he had to spend his own money to replace them. He walked into a vet telling him to cuff everyone still here and they'll sort them out later. Jimmy grabs the closest guy, they struggle a little and go to the ground, and as they do, rip. Jimmy splits his pants, clean up the backside. He knew that people were going to make fun of him no matter what. So, he turned to the other police officers and said, "Well, looks like we need another uniform." Then, he accidentally pressed the button on his radio. Everyone in the county heard, "Uniform down," and the situation got serious. The radio explodes with chatter. But the 3 cops at the bar already have their hands full, so they turned down their radios. Bass decided to roll everything with lights to the scene. Jimmy mentioned that they were initially happy to receive help when a few cars arrived, but then more and more kept coming. He used to be called Jack the Radio Ripper before he moved to a different department. He got a small punishment, and he still had to pay for the pants. Story 7. Former Royal Canadian Mounted Police here, from a small tourist town, was working on a regular midweek day shift when we received a dispatch call for a bomb threat. We were in the part of town with lots of businesses and factories. We all rushed there, brought in experts to handle a potential bomb, used dogs to search for any danger, and made sure people stayed away. While we were working on the road, we got another call that the silent alarm at the nearby bank had been activated. Now we're in Canada, in a tourist town, things are usually relatively calm. But this was absolutely chaotic. We got the all units call, they call our neighboring detachment to help, we all split and head to the bank. We arrive, around 20-some patrol cars all around, there to see all the bank employees bound and gagged, smoke everywhere from smoke bombs. We soon figured out that the bomb threat was just a distraction. We quickly alerted everyone to be on the lookout for 3 men, who were recognized by the bank staff, including one who used to work at the bank. We get the bolo out to CPIC, got words to airports and border crossings. We managed to catch 2 out of 3 of the guys. The last one flew back to his home country, was in Canada on a student visa. We were on high alert for days after this, searching for the 3rd person involved. Canadian authorities worked with the authorities from the other person's country to have him sent back for trial almost a year later. In the end, if I remember correctly, about $130,000 were stolen and not found. For most of us it was the first time we had a bomb threat and/or a robbery. The first time we were guarding an area expecting to be shot at from an unknown location. The robbers were reported to have AK-47 type looking weapons. Years ago, a friend of mine was a dispatcher for the county. He covered sheriff, EMS and fire communications. And also worked with communicating with other agencies as well. From the state troopers he got some sort of text communication. Not a phone text, this was before that kind of thing. And it referred to an accident with injuries at the intersection of I-40 and Business 85. There was a mix-up in interpreting a message about a road incident. The person who received the message misunderstood it and thought that a bus had collided with 85 people on I-40, so all the emergency vehicles were sent to the scene. However, when they arrived, it turned out to be just a minor 2-car accident with a few injuries. Edit. Wasn't actually I-40, but I can't remember which highway it was. Somewhere in Davidson. I know the bus 85 part is right though. I had to read that line like 5 times to make sure I was reading it correctly because I'm like, that makes it sound like there's 85 injuries. Then I read a little further and I'm like, oh, that's the point. Surely there was a better way to say that. Story 9. During my time interning at the local police department, I witnessed the introduction of new radio devices at all the stations. These devices resembled old cell phones and were equipped with a noticeable bright orange panic button on the top. The purpose of the panic button was to alert others in case an officer was in danger and needed immediate assistance. Pushing that button resulted in all communications on the standard channel 1 being turned to one-way communication only, so all units would listen to what's going on whenever the panic button was pressed. And in automatic, all free units call. All other units had to use a less powerful channel, but on this channel only one device could speak at a time. To turn off the panic mode, you had to press the bright orange button in a specific manner. Think of something like holding it for 3 seconds followed by 4 quick pushes. It could not be done remotely. This happened in a rather large city where some police stations are closed at night. Usually the ones in the suburbs where few calls come in. That night an older PO closed down the remotest station in the suburbs and decided to shut off the radio devices. You guessed it, he pushed the panic button on top because he thought that's where the devices were to be turned on and off. He didn't realize what he had done. He closed the office and went home. Because it was the first day of using the new equipment, many officers weren't sure how to switch to channel 2. This meant that all communication was cut off. Cue panic everywhere with frantic cell phone calls to dispatch. And dispatch was trying to figure out who closed that station, and thus had one of the only keys to open it, so the panic mode could be disabled. This unintentional all units call turned into an actual no units can call, though quite a few units were busy trying to resolve the situation. Story 10. Calls that go out to all units are actually more common and less urgent than what you see in movies. Instead, what you might be thinking of is something called a code swordfish. A memorable one a few years back was during a celebrity night. They were doing this charity event with a couple of famous personalities, amongst which was Helen Mirren. When the clock strikes 2 a.m., a secret code word, swordfish, is whispered, setting off a frenzied rush as everyone clamors to the event. The scene was a coke-fueled bedlam of apocalyptic proportions. People screeching and tearing at each other's faces, a man biting into a live cat, a pool filled with foam, chlorine, and offal, and in the middle of all this was Dame Mirren. She was riding bareback on a fat, hairy man, slapping her thighs in excitement and screaming her head off. I've never seen so much vigor and ecstasy in a single person before. She was making this weird facial thing like a horse blowing raspberries and throwing loud wet farts one after another. We tased her but she ran butt naked into the street, climbed a palm tree and swung away from tree to tree. We found her a day later when the effects of the cocaine had worn off, and she sneaked into a local chicken farm to sleep. This seems like a sarcastic response. I don't fully understand it, but it seems specific enough that someone might. So if this means anything in particular to you and it's hilarious, please enlighten the rest of us. Story 11. Usually about once a month or so we're taught that if you need backup, if stuff starts hitting the fan, call it in and worry about how many people come later. 2 weeks ago, a police officer was on patrol when someone started shooting at them. The officer radioed for help using the code, 34th Street, 1033, I'm taking fire, which means they needed immediate assistance. It all ended fine, we caught the guy, no injuries. But you better believe every officer in our area dropped what they were doing and went. Another recent one is a mini riot that broke out at a candle vigil for a murder victim. A police officer tried to break up a fight by himself and ended up getting overwhelmed. We had to step in, break up the crowd, and leave. Edit. Good chance to rant about a pet peeve of mine. When a 1033 goes out, there are always a few units who block the air with useless chatter. Hold me responding, what's their location? Dispatch, I'll come back to my current assignment later. Why do they need to have a gun there? It's frustrating. Stop talking on the radio. Let the team that's in a life or death situation have clear communication. And every unit not on something absolutely necessary is required to respond. Why would you waste time to say you're going? Yeah, no duh. Story 12. Not a cop, but former practicing journalist. Current PR person. Got a text about a shooting. Turns out a cop made a stop, got shot in the neck by the passenger, ended the life of the passenger, and shot the driver and the driver got away. Police officers from the 2 nearby cities, sheriff's deputies, airport police, and university police all arrived in less than 3 minutes. About 150 officers in total. Within 30 minutes, marshals, FBI, and ATF were there as well. Largest response I've ever seen. There were rounds that had been fired into the buildings surrounding that area. It was a mess. I was in the wrong place at the right time, I guess. Last story I ever did. Switched to working in public relations full-time. This is story 13. It wasn't an emergency involving all units, but it was the day my daughter stopped responding after having a fever-related seizure. The dispatcher sent out, unresponsive 2-year-old and we had about 30 EMT, police, firefighters at our house in minutes. We live in a rural area, short distance from fire hall/ambulance hall. Thankfully she was okay, but it was scary for us at the moment when her temperature wouldn't go down and then she passed out. Story 15. One that stands out was a chase which ended with a crash. 3 dead people in a trunk full of guns and drugs. But there's robberies, pursuit assists, and man with gun calls, all of which usually get opened up depending on the situation. And always officer down or needs immediate assistance, 10 to 24, if you're close especially. They hit that button or shots start going off. I'm dropping everything, grabbing my 416, and traveling light speed and coming in with everything I've got. Story 16. Corrections here. When I was first on the job, I was doing an overtime shift in the maximum security unit. It was my Friday, just 1 more hour to go before my birthday weekend. It was 2 o'clock, and I was counting down the minutes when a call came in over the radio. The central control asked to activate the IMS for housing unit 3. An inmate was refusing to follow instructions and had broken the fire sprinklers in his cell. Requesting a team response, put B team on standby. IMS has code for locking down everything. When you hear an IMS call, that means every inmate that is not in a cell must be secured. When something like this happens, it's a big deal because it means more officers have to stop what they're doing to help out. This leaves fewer officers to handle their normal duties, which can make the situation much more dangerous. In simple terms, events like this pose a serious security risk. In this case, Max was put on lockdown while the rest of the institution kept about their business. Interesting thing is, when an IMS comes out for Max, the collective prison sphincter cinches up a bit, because Max is where the real violent stuff goes down. An A team is always the first to respond, but the kicker with this one was the command to put the B team on standby. It's a serious situation, and anyone who isn't directly supervising the inmates might have to get involved if they're told to. If a second team is sent to the maximum security area, the whole 7,000-bed prison would go into a total lockdown. This would mean no doctor's appointments, visits, or movement around the building would be allowed. You'd hear Sally Port doors slamming shut everywhere. Really cool to experience it, honestly. There's also C, D, and E teams. Once I was called up to respond to the situation as the new guy, things got intense pretty quickly. As soon as I arrived at the briefing area, we were instructed to gear up in riot gear and biohazard coveralls without delay. Other officers helped us suit up so no skin was exposed. Only being a few weeks out of the academy, I crapped myself. This was not only my first team response, but also a biohazard. Blood, seed, urine, crap, which is it, Sergeant? All of them. I don't believe in Jesus, but I did briefly for that moment. When we were escorted into the unit, it was a war zone. The whole apartment was filled with gas, and there were fire alarms going off and red lights flashing all over the place. Even though we put on our gas masks quickly, they didn't work very well. The first police officers who arrived had to go inside without any protection. The dude was still in his cell. He had been gassed, maced, and hosed. He was unrelenting. I thought, he's gotta be on PCP. And then I remembered, this is Max. Nothing gets in or out. The inmate was butt naked covered in God knows what, screaming unintelligibly. He was bleeding from his arms due to having bitten full chunks out of them. His cell was watered down from the sprinklers and from getting sprayed with any number of OC variants. The most remarkable thing, this guy was incredibly aroused and visibly so. It seems like something primal in his mind got really turned on during all of this. Even his dong being exposed to OC spray did nothing to stop it. We stack up in a line. For cell breaches, 6 of us would line up in a stick. The person on point always had the shield. 2 to 5 had the cuffs. The last guy was the moderator. They would give the inmate a final opportunity to comply because the pain was freaking coming. Inmate, this is your last opportunity to approach the door and cuff up. Do you comply? Yeah, of course not. When the inmate saw the 6 officers in full riot gear lining up outside his cell, something changed in him. It was as if he had a moment of realization. He cooperated, was taken out of his cell, and thrown into a shower. I didn't even have a chance to enter the cell. It can be a really humbling experience to see 6 officers in full riot gear lining up outside your door, knowing they're about to enter your cell in just a few seconds. Edit. Sorry for the letdown of a conclusion. The reality of these situations is that we have to contain the threat. There are only 2 outcomes. Containment or people getting murdered. I highly recommend the HBO documentary Gladiator Days, which depicts the outrageous violence at the institution I served at. I wonder what made that guy who was completely losing it and causing so much chaos suddenly change his mind and decide to cooperate. It seemed like he was in a blind rage, but he must have still had some presence of mind to make that decision. Anyway, don't worry about the letdown of a conclusion. Because if we think about it, any other conclusion is significantly worse for everyone involved. We got the good ending. Story 17. My father was a highway federal officer, and this was in Mexico. They were armed with the light machine guns of standard caliber because stuff gets real. Against cartels here in the northern border, but it's so big and spaced out you have to deal with it yourself because the nearest unit can be an hour plus away, and they have reinforced trucks. Anyway, he once told me that he encountered a convoy of 3 Humvees while he was on the side of the road, relatively hidden. He opened fire at the first Humvee's tires and it loses control. The other 2 brake, and like 12 dudes with Kalashnikovs come out to fire in random directions. My father fired his gun to stop some bad guys, and then the police arrived to arrest them. This is from Story 18. A friend of mine was a canine cop with a local small police department. He was a solid guy, but by his own admission, wasn't the brightest. As an example, he couldn't learn the German commands for the dog, so they had to teach the dog English. Anyway, one day an all-call or whatever it's called came in. There was a shooting, which doesn't happen often around here. My friend was in the bathroom at the time, and his dog was in his SUV. The police officers rushed out and got into the nearest available car. The dog was in the back seat. When another officer got into the SUV, the dog got scared and bit the officer's neck. He panicked and started yelling into his radio. All the other cops thought he arrived at scene and had been shot. My friend, hearing this on the radio and knowing how his dog acts, ran out of the bathroom pulling his pants up. Havoc ensued. I remember one time when I was about 15 years old, my mom's boyfriend, who was into drugs, started beating her up. I had to call the police for help because things got really bad, and I was afraid for my mom and my little sister. It was a scary and intense situation, but I knew I had to do something to protect my family. I got as far as the address when he grabbed me by the neck and threw me, while the dispatcher heard my garbled yells and called it in as a possible homicide in progress. That, combined with his reputation, sent every single cop in the surrounding jurisdictions flying our way. By the end of it I think there were 20+ officers at our house. I ended up hitting him with my mom's cast iron skillet to keep him there just as the first officer showed up. He was super cool about it and pretended he didn't see a thing. It was a terrible night and my mom was mad at me for months, but man, you do not screw with my little sister. Story 20. I used to work in West Belfast, Northern Ireland. In the area where I worked, there was a high level of danger, so we always patrolled in 2 heavily armored Land Rovers. Each vehicle had at least 3 armed officers, and one of them carried a powerful gun like an assault rifle or submachine gun. Basically we could handle most scenarios. One day, however, our vehicle was in an intentional, head-on collision with a stolen car, as it was driving towards local children playing in the street. This resulted in our front wheel arch bending to the point the vehicle could travel no more. In a few minutes, the community we were there to protect turned against us. It was like Black Hawk Down. A few hundred people came out of the woodwork, as they realized we were an easy target. As we tried to chase a car thief on foot, we were suddenly attacked with petrol bombs and bricks. We quickly got into our vehicle and called for help. Within 5 minutes, a group of about 5 or 6 heavily protected trucks arrived and pushed the attackers back. They managed to tow us to safety, and we lived to get bricked another day. Story 21. In Duluth, Minnesota, there was a time when police officers used the code word, Broken Arrow, to communicate and meet up at Dunkin' Donuts. However, this secret code was accidentally overheard by someone who wasn't from the city and caused quite a stir. He became worried and informed the rest of the newsroom that the secret code likely meant that the police station was currently in a difficult situation and needed all the help they could get. Reporters hurried to the scene, only to find donuts. That secret code is no longer used. Story 22. Not a police officer, but I had an incident where 20 police cars were in my neighborhood the day my mom passed away. They wouldn't let us see her until after the autopsy came back and she had a heart attack. My entire house was filled, and it was a decent-sized house. One was sitting in my gaming chair looking through things, like, dude, you're not gonna find anything on a 14-year-old girl's desk. It was around 9 a.m. when I found her, and by the time they all left, it was close to 11 p.m. TLDR, my mom died, and police stayed for almost 14 hours. Hey there, Op. It seems like there's some important information missing from your story. Can you please provide more details about what happened, why the search was at your house, and who was suspected? It would help us understand the situation better. Story 23. My uncle told me a story once about getting called on a code swordfish, which is a bit more serious than all units. There was this coked up, 6-foot-something huge guy who had just shot up a liquor store and was tearing down the interstate. He told us there were probably about 15 cop cars already tailing him when he caught up, with 2 state troopers leading. When he got onto the interstate, he was practically right next to the guy. Someone forced his car off the road, and he jumped out while it was still moving and ran across the highway. Then he jumped over a fence and fell about 10 feet on the other side before running into the woods. Two police officers immediately started chasing after him, with my uncle not far behind. One of them didn't realize how far the fall was and broke his ankle. The other chased down the guy. By the time my uncle got there, the other state trooper was staggered and about to pass out from how hard his butt got kicked. My uncle, without breaking his sprint, charged the guy, throwing the heaviest haymaker he could. The person left right away. Afterwards, they had to go to the hospital to give information, because they had to bring the person in for drug-related issues. My uncle was sitting on a chair with his hat over his hand in his lap. The doctor comes in and asks how big of a flashlight did he hit the dude with. My uncle just lifts his hat and shows his bruised and swollen hand. Apparently he hit the guy so hard it fractured his temple and very nearly ended his life. Story 24, our calls are never ordinary. While our main focus is on rescues, we also collaborate closely with local police departments when needed. One's got called for a dirt bike accident on a trail. Story starts out that kid's broken up pretty bad, lost, and can't get out of the trail. It's a 7-mile trail and only wide enough for one ATV to get through at a time. All traffic goes one way. None of us live that way, so none of us have a bike with us. And I'm the only one who's ridden the trail. While I'm on my way to the starting point of the trail, I'm listening to the radio and thinking to myself, these people are making a big mistake. It's going to take us at least 4 hours to locate and rescue the kid. So why are they trying to send a helicopter? There's nowhere for it to land, and they won't wait around for us for that long. Local search and rescue screwing stuff up. They'll be on IV fluids within the hour. Helicopter flies through, then leaves. Oh, big surprise there. Word gets out that another group riding got the kid and they're taking him to the highway. Group actually rides through to the end of the trailhead. A child is okay, but his bike got damaged. He was wearing earbuds underneath his helmet, and when he fell, he hit his head really hard. This impact was strong enough to break the earbuds inside his ears. And just like that, I will never wear earbuds inside my helmet. And another one which I was off for, but the original call is too good. Dispatch calls saying, there's an alligator eating a person in the river. This is a serious situation and one of our biggest fears. It will change how we deal with alligators in the future. We need to go out there, catch and remove a 12+ foot alligator, and find a body that hasn't been reported missing. So they all scramble to get a boat in the water before this thing leaves and goes to sleep for 2 weeks with a full belly, because then the half-eaten body sinks and no amount of dragging or side sonar will help find it in the flooded river. Other agencies are getting out there too. They find the alligator and it's eating a dog. Hey, so these people were joking around when suddenly they spotted a body floating in the river. It turns out that a guy who had run away from the police a few days earlier had tried to cross the river, but unfortunately drowned. His body ended up floating to the surface just as they were there. On a positive note, they did manage to catch the person who was harming dogs. Son of a gun made the paper. In all honesty, I think the couple who originally made the call accidentally drowned their pet when the river flooded and the alligator found the carcass later. They were guilt-ridden and needed a scapegoat for their ignorance, and 2 alligators died for it. Because of the media, we were forced to remove one. We knew there's no realistic way to get the one who actually ate the dog, so we just had a trapper set a line and remove the first gator over 8 foot that took the bait. As soon as you remove one, another shows up. So there was this couple who got upset because we didn't catch the big alligator they wanted. But we set up another line and ended up catching one that was just over 11 feet long. We're just like, for the love of God, just don't see another alligator, people. In between these two, I was out with a partner looking for the dog murderer. We mostly hooked them on rod and reel. Based on the pictures and location, we found it. We hooked into it and immediately knew we would never catch it. This huge guy pulled an 18-foot boat up a flooded river like it was soggy newspaper. Had us dipping so low we were worried about capsizing. Swam under a log and we kept fighting till the line finally broke. After being under for well over 45 minutes, this thing pops up like 15 feet from us and crawls up onto a fallen tree and sandbar. Starts huffing, trying to get some oxygen back. We are just stunned staring at it. Like we just made the Placid Lake monster upset and it's coming for revenge. My partner has been doing this for many years, and he says it's the biggest alligator he's ever seen. The alligator was over 13 feet long and was still partially underwater. Its color matched the picture of the notorious dog-eating alligator, confirming that this was indeed the same one. But he's staying on this planet for a while longer. Story 25. Not a cop but hopefully relevant. A couple of summers ago, I was hanging out at a beach in Chicago when things got a little crazy at a party nearby. The party got too crowded, and the police showed up to ask the mariachi band to stop playing, hoping that people would leave. This was a no-go and crowd responded by, among other things, breaking the squad car windows and surging in around the cops. One of whom put out a no-crap call. I don't know the details, but apparently Chicago cops have a code that basically means drop. Whatever you're doing, get the hell over here. In less than a minute and a half, Wilson Avenue was filled with cars racing like in the famous car chase at the end of the movie Blues Brothers. It felt like at least 50 cars speeding towards the lakefront, one after the other. Like a high-speed parade of cop cars celebrating "we're gonna screw you up and then arrest everybody" day. Which, well, basically it was. Story 26. Not a police officer but the person all units were focused on. My high school had an open campus. So some friends and I were at one of their houses a few blocks away for lunch one day. Earlier today, my friend and I were playing with an airsoft gun in his backyard. Some of the neighbors mistook it for a real weapon and called the police. When we came out of the house, we were surprised to find ourselves surrounded by a SWAT team. I'm talking 15 officers with full armor and assault weapons. Once I was on the ground I looked around and saw 4 or 5 police cars parked across the street with snipers on us. We didn't end up getting in any trouble because, hey, didn't do anything wrong. I believe the reaction was completely justified given the urgency and concern surrounding school shootings. Story 27. Never a policeman but I used to work in the security industry. I was quite well known by the local officers and had quite a few dealings with them both in and out of work. My mobile phone while on duty, bit odd. It was the local custody sergeant. Apparently there had been a call that a child was being attacked in some woodland next to my site. I was called to go quickly to the location mentioned in the report because I could get there before the police. I arrived and started searching the small forest for anyone I could find. The whole time I was crapping myself. What if I find someone doing something to a kid, what do I do? I mean, I probably shouldn't end their lives. Could I not? Could I just frighten him off the kid and take control there? Would I be able to control my anger? All those thoughts happened in a flash, plus more. I was running around in that area for a while and then I heard cars arriving outside. Before I knew it, the local police were there. We searched the area but didn't find anyone. No sign. Horrible moment. Story 28. The first and only cavalry charge I've ever seen was in Brooklyn. There was this ride on the W12 in Bowery and Coney Island in the late 80s called the Polar Express. You've all seen it. There's this ride that goes super fast in one direction, then reverses while playing really loud music. It's kind of silly, but whatever. This also drew in a lot of people in Brooklyn who didn't have much money and couldn't get into a club, or got kicked out of all of them on weekends. It was a total nightmare. There were always fights, but you learned to let them tire themselves out a bit before you waded in because things could get ugly. I was detailed to this thing with a small army of other rookie cops on the 4th of July weekend. We were told in no uncertain terms to not go into the crowd, ever. Nothing is happening in there that's ever worth your safety. So of course a brawl breaks out and someone immediately goes in. Now please understand, you have to go now. You can't just leave the other guy alone, even if he messed up. The crowd clears a path for us like in the story of Moses parting the Red Sea. Then they close in around us again, throwing rocks and bottles like airmail. We stand back to back, like in the movie, 300, but there are a lot more of them than us, and we're pretty drunk. We're fighting our way out and there's backup trying to fight its way in to get to us, but it's taken time. And I don't know if you've literally ever fought for your life, but God, it's tiring. That adrenaline jolt only buys you so much time. I witnessed a group of police officers on horseback charging into a crowd at full speed like they were charging into battle. The officer in the middle had a big grin on his face and looked like he was living his dream. It almost seemed like even the horse was enjoying it. Then I saw it. A flying wedge formation of mounted, charging down West 12th into the crowd at full speed, with the sergeant in the middle with his nightstick out, held like he was ordering a charge, and a crap-eating grin that said he wanted to do this for his entire life. Hell, I think the horse was smiling too. You'll hear the term crash a lot and it's hyperbole. Not here. No. A group of people suddenly charged into the riot, causing chaos and sending people flying in all directions, like a big ship plowing through rough waves. It happened so fast that the crowd and the police were equally shocked by what they had witnessed. I know sometimes people complain about the cost of maintaining mounted police units because they're seen as unnecessary backup for tourist photos, and oh my god, I am living proof that they are so much more valuable than that. Story 29. Late to the thread but here goes. As with most, not a police officer. I was a boarding officer in the USCG many moons ago. Typical 4-man boat crew on a USCG 41-foot. Early one morning on a normal harbor patrol, I notice a 75-foot motor yacht illegally anchored. Given the ship traffic coming and going in the pre-dawn light, it was totally unsafe. So I radioed the station and they advised we make contact. I shone a bright light on the yacht and woke up a guy sitting in a chair at the back. As soon as he saw the light, he ran inside the yacht. Unfortunately, this made our boat driver panic and he sped up, turned on the siren and lights, and started calling out over the loudspeaker that we were from the Coast Guard and the yacht should be ready to be inspected. Of course, now everyone's adrenaline is flowing, and what was just an illegal anchoring situation was now in the mind of these other guys, the world's biggest drug bust about to go down. See, the ship had a Mexican registry. So we come alongside and immediately, make the determination that the ship is too large to be boarded. We escorted them back to the station. This part is when everyone in the unit gets called. By the time we got back to the station, every single member of my unit, along with every crew member on the bigger boats that were tied up at the station, were all on deck watching. There was another military base nearby with a large police force, so their police were on scene along with the local sheriff's department K-9 unit, U.S. Customs, DIA, and some guys in suits whose affiliation I was never able to figure out. Probably FBI or CGI, who knows. This was literally all hands on deck. A preliminary search of the vessel found a very small quantity of marijuana in the bedside table of the master cabin. There were 3 generations of a Mexican family enjoying their vacation, and it looked like mom or dad might have enjoyed a joint or two in the evenings back in their cabin. That's what it looked like to me. To onlookers, it seemed like a modern version of Pablo Escobar had arrived. They tore apart the yacht in their quest to make sure there were no hidden areas. They even used saws to dismantle the decks, thinking there might be things hidden there. As a lowly E3 pretty fresh out of boot camp, my part in all of this was armed guard for the family. I stood there with a Beretta 92F on my side and an M16 in my hands guarding grandma, grandpa, mom, dad, and the 3 kids. And as I stood there watching their boat be ripped to shreds over the discovery of a couple of joints, I asked myself, was I really supposed to shoot them if they tried to run or escape? Over a couple of joints and being illegally anchored, the illegal anchoring that I noticed and brought to everyone's attention, I discovered later this boat was not on any of our watch lists, and no one ever did find anything. The boat stayed tied up in a nearby marina for a couple of months and then just disappeared one day. I'm not sure what ever became of the boat or the family, but I hope they're well. I'll never forget that day. I was filled with guilt and remorse for what those poor people endured, which made me question my decision to join. While I treasured the search and rescue aspect of the Coast Guard's mission and have wonderful memories of the good deeds I accomplished, the law enforcement responsibilities didn't sit well with me. It felt like a constant struggle that I couldn't shake off. So when our wonderful US Congress failed to come up with a budget and we shut down the government briefly, the chief walked into morning muster one day and said, "Hey, 1 to 1 out. Come to my office at 1100 hours today for processing to the inactive ready reserve." It felt like a dream coming true. During my time in service, I achieved everything I needed and made a positive impact. I am extremely grateful that I will never have to use a weapon around the elderly and children or cause harm to others for something as minor as a couple of joints. You know what? I bet these people weren't even compensated for the boat being destroyed because they found the joints. I bet they were like, our search was justified because we found illegal substances, a class 1 or whatever the US system is drug. And yeah, the nationality of the family definitely didn't help matters and implicit biases that may exist. This sucks for them. They super didn't deserve this. I really respect how you responded and how you feel about it though. Props for that. Story 30. Not a cop, but had all units on an Air Force base called on me. We found ourselves in a secure aircraft shelter with underground vaults holding nuclear warheads. Our task was to install an engine in a fighter jet and conduct operational tests. Additionally, we needed to empty the external fuel tank, so I attempted to burn out the fuel during the test run in order to remove the tank. The max allowable ground run limit unrestrained is 85%. It was the weekend, so no one was around to bust me if I went higher. I get up to 89% and it's still going slow. The ground guy asked me what I was at. He told me Bill had done 93%. Well, the challenge was laid down. I ended up jamming on the brakes and hitting full mill power, 102%. Here's the thing. The vaults had vibration sensors to prevent people from tunneling into the nukes. Suddenly, I saw all the police officers on the base gathered in front of the shelter. It was very noisy inside, and the officers rushed in with M16s, trying to cover their ears. They were shouting at my colleague on the ground to instruct me to stop the operation. I'm laughing my butt off watching these dudes with guns trying to function with the noise and holding a rifle. So I drop back down to idle and they're screaming for me to shut down. The cooldown period for a high-power run is 5 minutes. I spent 5 intense minutes running the engine at idle, subjecting everyone to the deafening roar of a GE-129 jet engine. As soon as I powered down, I was swiftly ushered out of the cockpit and evacuated to a spot 100 meters in front of the shelter. Determined, I sought out the highest-ranking officer to explain why the alarm had been triggered. A bunch of cops went to secure and inspect the shelter. I was talking to the guy in charge when one of the new cops comes running up saying they have a suspicious package. So I ask him what the hell is he talking about. He mentioned a bag near a massive red box. When I inquired if he meant my backpack next to the Snap-on toolbox, his boss insulted him and they all stormed out. Our commander showed up and talked me into never doing that ever freaking again and to have a nice weekend. TLDR, nuke alarms bring all the boys to the yard. Story 31. I'm not a police officer, but back when I was a reporter I had to write up a fun little story for the paper. The local university had a Greek week in which all the frats and sororities would compete for charity. At the end of the week they would gather together and carpool over to the local drive-in. Normally the campus required any gathering of more than a dozen or so people be registered. So they could send an officer to monitor for underage drinking. But because this wasn't an official party, no one bothered to tell campus police the plan was to go elsewhere. The neighbors ended up complaining about a party that wasn't authorized because there were many kids getting ready to leave in cars. As a result, a couple of campus police officers were called to ask the kids to leave. When the officers arrived, they found a large number of kids and some were being disrespectful to the police. They thought it was ridiculous that someone called the cops on a carpool. One of the officers then slipped on a beer bottle while walking into the frat house. But his partner didn't see why he had fallen. He was startled by a sudden crash, and as he turned to look, he saw his senior partner lying on the ground. Reacting swiftly, he sprinted to the cruiser to call for backup, believing his partner had been struck by a thrown bottle. However, being a relatively new recruit, he made a few small errors in his haste. Instead of using normal language, he decided to use codes. Instead of saying, "Hey, we're clearing out that unauthorized party and we could use a couple more officers," he used the codes for "Ride in progress, officers down on the scene and need immediate backup." Oh, and instead of using the campus police only band, they used the shared county band. Officers down. That's the urgent call that dispatchers don't take lightly. The message was rapidly relayed to units in 4 neighboring counties, as well as to various cities and towns. In no time, a convoy of around 200 police cars was en route to the campus. Cooler heads eventually prevailed, but not until a few hundred cops from about a dozen apartments had donned their anti-riot gear, fired tear gas into a crowd that had no idea they were rioting, and had detained everyone in a 2-block radius. Without realizing or intending to, the rookie had summoned nearly every officer in a 50-mile area. Story 32. I'm not a police officer, but last week there was a big standoff in the town over from me. A man held his wife hostage for a few days. I'm unsure of the backstory, but I believe the relationship was ending. When SWAT arrived, the home exploded when they tried to enter and 6 officers were injured. So they ended up calling officers from other surrounding towns. It was all over the news and you could see SWAT and POS everywhere. The man had a lot of smaller sheds in the backyard and everything started to catch fire. I believe the woman got out, but they found the man's charred body inside once they got the fire under control. Story 33. UK 2010. Wetherspoons on a crossroad on the main road out of the city. Just after the local football derby match at the pub had ended, I was chatting with friends outside when suddenly, a fleet of police vans and cars, with blue lights flashing and sirens blaring, arrived from all 4 directions. There were about 10 to 12 vehicles in total. A big guy in front of the pub started behaving aggressively towards both male and female officers, and then abruptly collapsed after being confronted. He was quickly arrested and taken away after the police used a taser gun to control him. After about 5 minutes, things calmed down and the officers began to leave. Then, a police officer showed up on his bicycle, looking out of breath after riding a couple of miles to help with the situation. Everyone clapped and cheered when he arrived. This is Story 35. Although I'm not a police officer, I used to work as a nurse in a prison. Every year, there's a picnic for the inmates who are serving life sentences. During the picnic, their families can come and visit them in the yard. One year during the picnic there were approximately 200 people milling about in the yard of the prison when inside the maximum security common room a fight broke out between 2 inmates. When one of the officers came up behind one of the inmates to try and separate them, she kicked backward and hit his shin in just the right place with her prison-issue boots and shattered his tibia. One of the other responding officers in the pod called across the radio, "Officer injured, officer down, send everyone." The radios are monitored by the local PD as well in case something serious happens like a riot or hostage situation. So the local PD intercepts this message and sends everyone. I'm serious when I say everyone, by the way. Police officers, federal investigators, ambulances, fire trucks, and even Parks Department vehicles rushed to the scene in a whirlwind of chaos. In the midst of it all, the Central Command was in the dark about the situation and the status of the injured officer. In a surprising move, they threw open the gates, and a flood of responding officers descended upon the prison. The poor 200 people in the yard were swooped down upon by the literal 100 officers with guns. Fortunately the situation was cooled down quickly and no one else was injured, but it was so congested with cars the gates to the prison were wide open with empty police cars left running and unattended. I was actually surprised that not a single inmate tried to take advantage and sneak out, although the prison was on lockdown for the next 24 hours while they tried to complete the investigation and sort out the chaos. Story 36. If you want to know how screwed up our immigration system is, here you go. I was a CBP officer for 2 years, so according to someone here I wasn't a real cop, but I nonetheless was in law enforcement. If someone is traveling from specific countries in Europe and Asia, they can visit the US for up to 3 months for business or pleasure without needing a visa. So, this person arrived using a visa waiver, but at that time, there were 2 different systems for processing travelers. One was integrated and the fingerprints and pictures went into the systems with the passport info at the same time. At the Midfield or Connections terminal, someone coming to the US but going on to a different city, we used a system that had 2 programs where one had fingerprints and picture or biometrics and the other processed the passport. You had to wait for the biometrics to come back before you approved the passport. We once had an officer on our team who perplexed us all. Her English skills were limited, and there were rumors swirling that she might have been a mail-order bride from an Asian country, perhaps Thailand. It was hard for us to fathom how she made it through the academy with such language barriers. Rest easy though, weary travelers, most CBP officers are far more qualified than she was. We think she knew someone to get the job. As she was processing a passenger English or Scottish, can't remember, she didn't let the biometrics finish and admitted him. After the inspection, he hit on biometrics and he had a bench warrant in NYC. Everyone available had to search the airport for this guy. About 20 of us ran through the airport looking for him. We thought it was some catastrophic crime. So the funny part, and I'm likely gonna get downvoted for this, but she had a hard time telling one white person from the other. I know everyone jokes we think all Asians look alike, but it works vice versa too. So, we only had a copy of the bench warrant, and no photo to work with. Imagine the scene. There are like 6 different guys, and she thinks each one of them is the guy we're looking for, but they're all American. Finally, we spot a guy who seems really friendly. We ask him about the bench warrant, and he casually mentions he got into trouble in New York, but was told it wasn't a big deal. We decide to call the originator of the warrant, and bring the guy back to the inspection area with us. And that's when things really started to get complicated. Turns out, he was found high by a cop, but was pretty much taken in and dismissed. The warrant was for a follow-up court date, but for some reason it wasn't mandatory. It was sort of just there in case he got arrested in NYC, so someone knew that there had been previous contact. So we could have let him go. The issue was that he admitted on his entry form that he'd been a drug addict, which is immediate denial of entry. We asked him about it and he said he was on his way to a treatment facility run by Eric Clapton's foundation and that he had been clean but thought he might relapse. So his parents footed the bill so he could stay clean. He had all of the documents with him and showed them to us, but we had to send him back. If he hadn't shown up under the influence and admitted to using drugs, we could have allowed him in. The supervisor was actually considering giving him permission, but it's not legal to change an entry document once it's been stamped. We told the guy we had to deport him and he just smiled and was like, okay, gonna get a bite to eat. He didn't even seem bothered. We told him he could come back with a B1 or B2 visa and he said he would apply as soon as he got home. He said, it's just a bump in the road. I'd rather go through this clean than go through anything I went through the past few years. I know it may sound wrong, but I wish he had gotten away. It was her screw up that caught him and we scrambled to catch a guy who was just trying to better himself. I still think about this person and it really got me thinking about my views on drug addiction back then. The person's attitude showed that he couldn't be beaten, and I really respected that. However, it's fair to say that he should have done some research and gotten a visa. You can get a visa with his history, especially for medical reasons. We just admit so many people who are dirtbags that it shames me we had to send a decent guy home. Story 37. Obligatory, not a cop, but I'm a security guard at a homeless shelter and about 3 weeks ago some dirtbag rushed me and took a swing. I stepped back and flinched hard at him, meaning I was intending to swing 100%, but I balked because in my head I kept saying, no, you'll be fired. He's got to be close enough to threaten you for real or hit you to not get fired. And it was enough just to rile him up a bit and he squared up on me. At that moment all of my bros, no exaggeration 15 or 20, rushed to my aid, getting in between me and raging dude. They started screwing him up. I dashed into the chaos, pushing through the crowd to reach the person who was about to be attacked. Just then, about 15 police cars raced onto the shelter grounds. Later one of my cop bros told me a random uninvolved client called and told him I was being jumped by a group of homeless dudes with no backup, and being the stand-up badass dudes they are, they rolled everyone as fast as possible to try and help. And if you're wondering why so many, understand this and only this. Homeless people don't give a single crap about anything ever, and you can never predict what they might do. Never. Story 38. 3 years ago my sergeant was shot. And his life ended. attempting to talk to a child toucher probation violation warrant suspect out of his house. Guy shot him directly in the forehead through a window at an angle they didn't believe was possible. Hence the fact he was standing at a window. That morning, I was pepper sprayed during a training course for non-lethal force. On my way back home, I saw many emergency vehicles rushing through town. I decided to respond to the situation because nobody was responding on the radio. When I arrived at the scene, I was met by another law enforcement agency. It turned out that the person involved was a friend of mine, and he explained to me what had happened. Headed to the hospital after that. Halfway there I stopped to call my family so they wouldn't think the mental health officer murdered was me and completely lost it. After regaining composure I got to the ER and met with the rest of our unit and sergeant's wife. Hearing her screams standing over his dead body haunts me to this day. Guy gave up. My sergeant's wife didn't want to go through a multiple-year ordeal, and within 6 months, the piece of crap had signed a plea deal for life without parole as long as death penalty was taken off the table. Story 39. I'm not a police officer, but I'm pretty sure I saw one last Saturday. I was sitting in the car with my son, enjoying some ice cream in a gas station parking lot, when a police car drove by with its lights and sirens on. My son was thrilled to see it. A few minutes later, we noticed more police cars heading in the same direction and just one car going the opposite way. I'm assuming the lone car was the original one we saw go by, as there were no others that came from that way. Dude is flying, and the cars coming the other way stopped, so I'm wondering what's going on. Turns out there was a thrilling chase with a dark SUV that I didn't notice until it zoomed past us. Suddenly, several police cars made a U-turn right in front of me. I counted at least 8 cop cars racing by in just a few minutes. It was the most intense show the kid had ever seen, and I was freaking out too because I had never witnessed anything like that before. Meanwhile, my child was right there seeing everything that was happening. The next morning, I found out that the state patrol got involved and used a special maneuver to stop the SUV. And mind you, this all happened in a small city. We never see stuff like this. Story 40. A large wedding in Brooklyn. It was midnight, so there weren't that many units to begin with. The families started warring with each other, and when we arrived they of course turned on us, and everyone, and I mean everyone, was brawling. We turned out 3 cars that night and one of them was out on a homicide, so we're just yelling, "Keep 'em coming." Central. The duty captain, the supervisory officer for the patrol bureau, shows up, looks around, sees this is quickly becoming a rout, and calls a citywide 1013, which means a designated number of cars from every borough task force in the city. That was one of them. Story 41. One that stands out is an officer down call. It was a quiet night for the police. One officer was at the hospital watching a suspect, some of us were at the station, and one unit was on a traffic stop. The officer on the traffic stop was taking a long time, so dispatch checked on him. He said he was fine. In the station, we could hear the phones ringing loudly, both the 911 lines and the regular phone lines. Then we heard something over the radio. Officer down, X and Y Street, units code 3, officer down. What happened after that is sort of a blur, but we jumped in our cars and flew 100 miles an hour. The neighboring agency, which is very large, occasionally receives our 911 calls too. There is no hyperbole when I say their entire division responded, 15 plus cars, over 50 officers. They were amazing in their assistance and care for us. I was the first one to arrive at the scene. I found a group of people gathered around something, looking down. I asked them to move, and then I saw my friend lying on his back. I did my best to comfort him. Some old lady started praying over him, and I was a jerk to her. I feel bad about that one. My friend kept telling me to call his wife and sister and tell them, and I kept telling him that he would tell them himself. I knelt down and held his head in my lap. I removed his gun and shield and gave them to my boss. He was fine. The person he had stopped lied about who they were and then drove away. They pulled my friend with their truck and then ran over his ankle, breaking it. He was shipped off to the ER. The rest of that evening was long and stressful. Detectives, administration, crime scene, news reporters, etc. I prefer not to share more details about the person in question, but I can tell you that he was a wanted criminal convicted of assaulting 2 young children. Thanks to the hard work and collaboration of law enforcement, he was found hiding in South Texas. He received a 50-year prison sentence for the harm he caused and for violating the terms of his release. Additionally, he faced federal charges and was given another 20-year sentence in federal prison, to be served separately. Anyway, my friend is better and back to work. That night was one of the most difficult moments in my career. I can still hear the radio transmission in my head. A man was arrested by the Portland police for attacking 3 people with a blue lightsaber at a Toys R Us store on Hayden Island. It's quite unusual and definitely sounds like something out of a Star Wars movie. A 911 caller reported the incident about 9:50 p.m. and said the man was inside the store, swinging the Star Wars weapon of choice at customers. While the caller was on the phone, the man then left the store lightsaber in hand and walked out to the parking lot. Officers tried to arrest the man but he kept swinging at him. The police officer tried to use a taser on the suspect, but it didn't work. Another officer successfully used a taser on the suspect, but the suspect managed to knock one of the wires away with a lightsaber. The officers finally arrested the man after grabbing him and pinning him to the ground. The suspect was treated by medics at the scene and taken to an area hospital for mental evaluation. None of the victims of the lightsaber assault needed medical attention though. Okay, I don't. Was this an all units call? Did that happen? Because just looking at the post, this is a copy and paste from a news article. Like op is not even really the op of this comment. They're reposting the news in a Reddit comment. I think the image of a man using a lightsaber to fend off police officers is hilarious enough to share, but seriously, why are we just copying and pasting news articles into Reddit threads? What's that all about? Here's a story. My dad used to be a cop, but he passed away. We live in a small town with a small police department. He told me of this. The city borders the Pan American Highway, so there's always high traffic in the zone. Bear that in mind. Someone tipped the border patrol that a huge convoy of drugs had already passed to their zone and is heading to my city, but it's heavily guarded with watchers. A car with guys that will alert of police blockades and so, often a few miles ahead of the convoy, and grunts, the ones in charge of safety of the whole thing. In one of those unknown coincidences of life, the cops were doing a few checkup points on different roads in order to catch tax dodgers, and the watchers got stopped by one of those. One of the guys shot an officer in the chest, punctured lung, and survived the shot though. All hell broke loose. The radio went on, officer down. Dispatch dis. Dispatch all. The DIS is a special division like US SWAT, heavy weaponry and SWAT training. There was a situation involving blockades and a large police presence for a few hours. Units from far away had to come in to help. Tensions were high for a while. Eventually, the police found the convoy at one end of the blockade and all the units moved there. The convoy was stopped, and there were casualties. 3 police officers were injured, 3 people involved in the situation passed away, 2 were injured, and 6 tons of drugs were seized. Story 44. Former CO for a state prison and I was the reason for the call. We would often work understaffed, as the state doesn't pay as well as counties or municipalities. I was freshly certified, 2011, completed the academy and state certification less than 60 days prior, and I was called by one of the dorms that only had 1 staff member assigned. She had noticed suspicious activity. I grabbed another staff member, female who completed the academy even more recently than I, and went down the wing. There were too many people in one room. They weren't supposed to be there, so we asked the extra people to leave. Then, we made the 2 people who were supposed to be there wait outside while we searched the room. Mistake number 1. Always handcuff an inmate prior to a search. Go through his property and end up finding a very small implement. Looked like a cartridge from pen or something with a small bit of razor melted into it. Maybe a quarter of a US dime. Inmate claims it's for cleaning between his teeth. Usually, if someone is found with something illegal, like a weapon, they would get put in jail right away. But on that night, there was a lieutenant who was easily upset. He's the type of person who would cancel a jail sentence just because I didn't ask for his permission first. I go upstairs and call it in. Clear it with the lieutenant, and he tells me to escort him to see him and he'll make the determination. Now, this is where it goes sideways. I return to the wing, pull my cuffs and tell the inmate to turn around. Inmate starts flapping his gums about it's my birthday, this is BS, blah blah blah. Not hearing it, tell him to turn around one final time. Before I realize what happened, I'm recovering from being hit in the face. And at this point I've dropped the cuffs on the ground. I didn't see the guy throwing a punch or anything, I just remember feeling off balance and thinking, did he just hit me? Then, I saw him attacking the female officer I was with. I wasn't experienced and wasn't thinking straight. I reacted by putting the inmate in a headlock, which was another mistake. Not an approved move, not by a long shot. I start punching him in the face. I yell to the female to ask if she's okay and she's fully engaged and active. She comes over to grab the inmate and attempt to restrain him. At this point the inmate has decided he's not a fan of my armpit and would like to be free. He turns his head in and bites the hell out of me. Reflexively, mistake number 4. I let go of the inmate and gasp in pain. He turns towards the female officer again, who has not been successful in restraining the inmate, and her glasses are in several dozen pieces on the floor. This gives me a moment where the inmate and I aren't sharing a personal bubble. I pressed the button on my personal alarm and then took it off. There's a safety feature that triggers if you take it off your belt, the string on the top of the device gets loose. And I hit the red button on my radio. I find out later that the woman in the bubble, the officer stationed, did not know what was going on, and did not know we were in trouble until the control room called a zone alarm. Something to the effect of, there's a body alarm activated in Echo Dorm Wing 1. These issues are often not considered important. When she noticed what was going on, that's when they called for an emergency. Back to the situation, he's swinging at the female officer again and I lock him in yet another headlock. I'm having a hard time learning something new, and this time it's on the opposite side of my body. I'm trying to punch someone in the face and make their head hit the wall, but I'm struggling because the angles and my grip aren't quite right. It's not having the desired effect. At this point I have an epiphany. Neither of us have deployed chemical agents. I rip my holster, yank my OC and begin spraying the inmate. The inmate is in the middle of biting me again when the spray hits him in the eyes and nose. He lets go and manages to get a good mouthful as well. At that moment, we went down to the ground, and he lost all will to fight. He just wanted the whole thing to end. I maintained my grip until the female officer was able to secure his hands with handcuffs. I got up and was about to start clearing the area when the security officer, who had been checking the outside of the building, rushed in and started clearing out the area as he ran down to where we were at the back of the building. He was the first person to arrive, and he was outside the fence when the call was made. Despite being 6 feet 4 inches tall and over 400 pounds, he ran really fast and beat out all the more athletic people. We were roomies and best friends. Might have had something to do with it. The lieutenant and a few other people show up. We were ushered off the wing and they began the post-use of force recording. Before the end of the night the inmate was escorted to medical, spit on the officer transporting him, screamed at the top of his lungs about how he was in Vietnam and had both of his arms cut off and that we treated him unfairly the whole boot. He was moved from medical to confinement pretty quickly, where he refused to decon shower so they sprayed him again. The person in question was not wearing any clothes, so you can imagine how chaotic the situation was. It took a week to move the person out of the facility. The female officer I was with was connected to someone who had been working in the department for a long time. They had to specially handpick a team of people who had never worked with him to transport the inmate. In the meantime, she and I were on outside vehicle patrol for the week. Because he had blood in his mouth when he bit me, I ended up on the cocktail. Thankfully, I can say after 7 years I am free of HIV or any other communicable stuff. I left corrections in 2015, and now I'm in IT. I make better money, not including overtime, but I enjoy the time with the wife, and no computer has ever bitten me, slung their waste at me, or gunned me. Story 45. I used to be a police officer, and I was in a car accident while chasing a vehicle. Another car hit the side of my police car pretty hard. It was a bad crash. My car spun around several times, crossed over the highway median, and finally stopped upright. Every airbag went off. I must have blacked out due to the impact. When I woke up, there was blood on the airbags and all over my uniform. I knew I had to call dispatch, but due to a concussion, I wasn't making any sense. All dispatch heard was that I was in an accident and I think I started mumbling nonsense. With the radio crackling, I heard my dispatcher yell for all units to my location. Cars all had GPS units. The car door was stuck and I thought I was never getting out. Thanks to an off-duty firefighter and plenty of other good Samaritans who saw what happened, they were able to pry the door off its hinges. I experienced a really tough situation, and at that exact moment, about 20 officers from different towns came to help me. It was a really humbling experience that I'll never forget. Even though I was hurt, it felt really good to receive such a quick and caring response. It's amazing to see how much people care about your safety. When I called for help over the radio, I can only imagine the relief that the dispatcher felt, knowing that help was on the way. Not a great sign. Anyway, that is the last story for today. So if you made it this far, thank you all so much for watching. Have an amazing day or night, no matter where you are. Looking forward to catching you in the next one.